Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this underlying expectation of precision, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's very cut and dry.
Yeah, it feels almost like engineering. Like if you fall off a ladder and break your arm, you get an X-ray. And that X-ray shows that jagged white line on the black film, and the doctor just points at it and says, there it is. That's the problem.
Right. You can literally see the fracture.
Exactly. You
Yeah.
see it, and you know exactly what needs to be fixed. It's very satisfying.
Well, it provides a profound sense of comfort, I think. Human beings really love when things are visible and categorical and, most importantly, binary.
Binary, right.
Right? Like you're either broken or not broken, you're
Right.
sick or you're healthy.
But then, you step into the world of theology, specifically when we start looking at the human condition, and suddenly that beautiful, precise X-ray machine just sort of shatters.
It completely falls apart.
It does. We find ourselves looking at this diagnostic landscape that is unbelievably murky. Because when you hear the word sin, and I mean, you hear it all the time in our culture, you likely picture a very simple, isolated, broken rule.
Yeah, a lie you told to get out of trouble or something.
A petty theft, an act of greed, a momentary lapse in judgment. Basically, you picture an action.
We definitely have a deep cultural tendency to reduce it to a discrete event,
Yeah.
like a literal line drawn in the sand that you intentionally stepped over.
But what if it is far more complex than just a simple rule violation? What if it is a terminal spiritual sickness, or like a glitch in our fundamental cognitive software?
Or even an invisible architecture, shaping the very foundations of our society.
Exactly. So our mission today is to take you on a comprehensive deep dive into the staggering, multi-layered Christian concept of sin. We're going to explore the mechanics of how it works. We'll grapple with the immense philosophical mystery of where it even came from, and uncover how it profoundly shapes the human condition.
And, to do a topic of this magnitude and need real justice, we are drawing on a deeply compelling stack of sources. We'll be analyzing some really rigorous philosophical breakdowns, historical overviews of hamartiology, which is the formal academic study of sin, and we'll be parsing through the dense theological frameworks of thinkers ranging from Martin Luther and Augustine all the way to contemporary philosophers.
It's a vast landscape, heavily debated and often deeply, deeply personal.
Oh, extremely personal.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Because before we can even begin to conceptualize the invisible architecture of society, we have to start with the absolute basics, the action itself, the anatomy of the act. The sources use this specific term you just mentioned, hamartiology.
Yes, or martiology.
Where does that word even come from? It sounds so clinical.
Well, the term is rooted in the ancient Greek word hamartia. Fundamentally, it describes a departure from either human or divine standards of uprightness. But the imagery behind the word is really what makes it so resonant, I think.
What kind of imagery?
In its original context, it was actually often used in archery. It literally translates to missing the mark.
Oh, wow.
Right, so you draw the bow, you loose the arrow, and it simply fails to hit the target.
Missing the mark.
Yeah.
That imagery almost implies, I don't know, a lack of skill? Or an accident? Like, I aimed for the bullseye, but the wind caught the arrow.
That's a common misconception, yeah.
But when we look at how the sources actually break down the mechanics of a sinful act, they split it into two distinct categories that prove this isn't just about accidental wind resistance, right?
Yeah.
It deeply involves the human will.
It's all about the will.
So we are looking at sins of omission and sins of commission.
And the distinction between those two is really the bedrock for understanding moral responsibility in this entire framework.
Mm-hmm.
So sin commission is the one we are all, intuitively familiar with.
The active stuff.
Exactly. It involves taking direct action to commit a sinful act. There's intentional forward movement. And theologians like Thomas Aquinas and Augustine famously broaden this beyond just physical deeds, too. Well, they categorized a sin of commission as a thought, a word, or a deed that goes against the eternal law. So you are actively, consciously introducing something contrary to the good into the world.
Okay, so Adam and Eve are reaching out and physically eating the fruit in the Garden of Eden. Or King David committing adultery. Those are deliberate, active choices. Your hands are moving, your mouth is speaking.
Precisely.
But then there's the other side of the coin, which is omission.
Omission kind of flips the dynamic entirely. It is the conscious knowledge that you ought to do a good thing coupled with the failure to actually execute it.
So it's an absence.
Yes, it is the profound absence of right action. Like you see someone in desperate need on the street, you have the financial and physical capacity to help them, you possess the internal knowledge that assisting them is the moral good, and yet You just keep walking.
And the sources are very careful to point out here that both omission and commission are considered active departures from the divine standard.
They're weighed very similarly.
That seems really counterintuitive at first glance, I have to say. How is not doing something considered an active departure?
Because your will is the driving engine in both of those scenarios.
Yeah.
In a sin of omission, you are actively choosing to suppress the impulse to do good.
Oh, I see. You're willing the inaction.
Exactly. You are willing your own inaction. The decision to withhold the good requires just as much internal agency as the decision to commit the bad.
Man, that puts an immense amount of weight on the internal state of the person acting. Which actually brings up a fascinating philosophical wrinkle from the philosopher Richard Swinburne in our research.
Oh, right. His breakdown of objective versus subjective.
Yes. Because if the internal will is so incredibly important, what happens if you do something you genuinely, in your heart of hearts, think is the right thing, but it's actually horribly wrong? Or vice versa.
Swinburne's framework is incredibly helpful for untangling that exact knot. So objective sin is a violation of the moral standard, plain and simple.
Regardless of how you feel about it.
Completely regardless. It is doing what is objectively wrong, entirely independently of your personal belief about the action. The standard just exists. Subjective sin, on the other hand, is doing what you believe to be wrong, even if your conscience is, miscalibrated and in error.
Okay, so let me map this out to make sure I'm following. If I perform an action that is, according to the divine standard, totally fine, say, I don't know, eating a specific type of food, but in my own conscience, I am utterly convinced that God has forbidden me from eating it, and I eat it anyway. I am committing a subjective sin.
Precisely, because what are you actually doing in that moment?
I'm rebelling.
Yes, you are exercising your will to rebel. You are acting against your highest conception of the good. You looked at what you believed was a divine boundary, and you chose to cross it anyway. Your internal orientation was defiance, even if the external action was essentially neutral.
That's wild, and the sources reference Philip Quinn, who flips that scenario to show the really terrifying alternative.
The erring conscience.
Right. A person with a deeply erring, broken conscience might commit an act that is objectively horrific, like persecution or intense violence, but they do it genuinely believing they are acting in divine righteousness.
In that scenario, they are committing a massive objective sin. They are tearing the fabric of the moral universe. But Quinn argues they might not be committing a subjective sin because their internal will isn't trying to rebel.
It's trying to obey.
Exactly. It's trying, however tragically and violently, to obey. And this entire distinction really proves that in Christian hamartiology, sin just cannot be reduced to an external checklist of actions.
No, it's inextricably tethered to the unseen internal orientation of the agent's will and intellect.
It's deeply psychological.
So if sin requires this deliberate departure from a standard, this, conscious rebellion of the will or a miscalculation of the intellect, it introduces perhaps the most mind-bending problem in this entire stack of research.
The origin problem.
Right. How did it ever start? We have to examine what the theologians call the primal sin.
The temporally first sin. And depending on the theological tradition you're looking at, this is either viewed as the prehistoric fall of the angels, so the rebellion of Lucifer, or the very first human sin committed in the Garden of Eden.
Either way, the philosophical headache this creates is staggering.
Oh, it's immense. The philosopher Scott McDonald captures the dilemma perfectly. We have to remember that this first sin appears against a backdrop of utter, pristine goodness.
Because in the traditional Christian framework, God created everything perfectly. There are no systemic inequalities yet.
No generational trauma.
Right. There is no bad environment or corrupt peer pressure to be influenced by.
You have perfectly good creatures, endowed with perfectly good wills, residing in a perfectly good environment, and somehow they voluntarily introduce evil into a reality where absolutely none existed before.
It's completely unprecedented.
It is unprompted. And logically, it seems entirely inexplicable. How does a perfect creature choose evil ex nihilo just out of nothing?
It reminds me of setting up a perfectly coded AI. The hardware is completely clean, there are 0 bugs in the source code, the input data is flawless, and then, out of nowhere, it just decides to output a malicious, destructive error.
Right.
How does that happen without an underlying glitch in the system?
That exact question has driven theologians to distraction for centuries. And looking at the historical debate, it essentially splits into 2 distinct warring camps: voluntarism and intellectualism.
Okay, I want to look at voluntarism first, which was championed by thinkers like Anselm. How does Anselm explain the perfectly coded AI suddenly going rogue?
Anselm approaches this by analyzing the nature of a free will itself. He argues that a truly free will has two core competing inclinations.
Okay, what are they?
The first is the desire for benefit, so the drive toward things that bring personal happiness, comfort, or advantage. The second is the desire for justice, which is the preservation of rightness simply for its own sake, honoring God's design.
So the creature basically has to balance what feels good with what is intrinsically right.
Exactly the tension. In the scenario of the primal sin, the agent was faced with a choice, and they chose the lower good of personal benefit over the higher good of universal justice.
But why?
Well, the crucial part of voluntarism comes when you ask Anselm why the agent made that specific choice. And his answer is essentially, just because.
Just because.
Basically, yes.
That can't be the whole philosophical defense.
That really is the core of it. Anselm argues there is no preceding cause.
Yeah.
The agent willed the rebellion simply because they possessed the sheer capacity to will it. The choice is its own efficient cause.
That's baffling.
For the voluntarist, the origin of evil is inherently mysterious and deeply irrational. A creature explicitly designed to love God should never find defying God attractive. But they chose to do it anyway, purely out of the uncaused, spontaneous volition of their own will.
I really struggle to accept that premise. I mean, if a choice truly has no preceding cause, if it happens just because, and is totally severed from any rational motivation, doesn't that make free will sound completely arbitrary?
It's a common critique, yes.
It doesn't sound like a meaningful moral choice anymore. It sounds like a quantum coin flip happening in the agent's brain. Like, heads they obey, tails they destroy the universe. If there is no reason behind the choice, how can you legitimately hold them morally responsible for it?
You are echoing the primary, devastating critique of libertarian voluntarism right there. By insisting that the choice has no prior cause, voluntarism fiercely protects the absolute freedom of the will. Nobody, not even God, forced their hand.
But at what cost?
At the cost of intelligibility. It sacrifices intelligibility to get there. We literally cannot understand the choice because by definition, there is no rational reason for it to be understood. It's a blind leap.
A completely blind leap.
And this profound dissatisfaction with the quantum coin flip idea is exactly why the other camp, intellectualism, takes a radically different approach.
So we are bringing in heavyweights like Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and contemporary philosophers like Alvin Plantinga. How does intellectualism solve this uncaused glitch?
By arguing that the will is actually blind on its own. The will doesn't just act randomly in a vacuum. It only acts based on what the intellect presents to it as a good idea.
So the intellect is like a scout.
Yes. The intellect is the scout, evaluating options and handing a recommendation back to the will. Therefore, for the primal sin to occur, the intellect had to fail first.
The scout handed back a terrible map.
Precisely. The agent must have failed to properly grasp the overwhelming normative reasons for loving God above all things. They either acquired a false belief, or they failed to deliberate sufficiently before acting, or they willfully ignored the knowledge they already possessed.
So the mistake happens upstream.
Right. Plantinga insists that the rebellion of the will must originate with a prior intellectual fault.
So they essentially miscalculated the value of reality. They looked at their own autonomy or the appeal of the forbidden fruit, and the intellect erroneously crunched the numbers and told the will, yes, this temporary benefit is actually more valuable than infinite communion with God.
The will only goes astray because the intellect fed it corrupted data, or it failed to process the pristine data correctly.
But wait. If they were created perfect, with pristine cognitive hardware, why did their intellect miscalculate? Why did the scout fail to read the terrain? Doesn't intellectualism just push the glitch one step further back into the shadows?
It does. It absolutely does.
So it doesn't really solve it either.
And that is the enduring, impenetrable mystery of the origin of evil ex nihilo. Voluntarism hits a wall where the will acts for no reason. Intellectualism hits a wall where perfect intellect mysteriously hallucinates a false value. Both frameworks ultimately struggle to comprehend how a pristine, flawless creation can initiate its own corruption.
Wow. But the truly terrifying reality of the historical Christian view is that this first sin, however it happened, whether through a blind leap of the will or a catastrophic miscalculation of the intellect, didn't stay contained.
Not at all.
It didn't remain as an isolated, baffling action in a pristine garden. It didn't stay as something a creature did. It rapidly and aggressively metastasized into something a creature is.
Which forces a massive pivot in our understanding. We really have to move away from looking at the anatomy of a single act and begin examining the architecture of the human soul itself.
Right, we're transitioning from sin as a verb to sin as a state of being.
To make that jump, we need to look at disposition first, because it bridges the gap perfectly. If you perform an action enough times, it ceases to be an isolated choice,
It
right?
turns a pathway in your brain.
Exactly. It becomes a habit. Pulling from the virtue ethics tradition, heavily influenced by Aquinas, we're talking about the formation of vices. Vices are these deep-seated habits of the soul that operate contrary to human flourishing. They are sinful dispositions.
Like the classic deadly sins.
Yes. Think gluttony, pride, wrath, envy. Once you possess a sinful disposition, the friction required to commit a sinful act plummets.
It's like a groove on a vinyl record. The needle naturally wants to slide into the deepest groove. Having a disposition toward wrath means your needle is naturally going to slide into explosive anger the very moment you are provoked.
That's a perfect analogy.
It doesn't absolutely guarantee you will yell, but it is the default path of least resistance.
Right, it's the default. But the philosophical rabbit hole goes so much deeper than just acquiring bad behavioral habits.
Yeah.
Marilyn McCord Adams, a really prominent contemporary philosopher in our sources, elevates this to a sheer ontological level.
Ontological, meaning related to the very nature of being.
Yes. She moves past psychology entirely and talks about sin as a fundamental state of uncleanness.
McCord Adams is fascinating because she seems to remove human agency from the equation almost entirely in this specific view. She views sin not primarily as something we choose to do, but as a profound impropriety that arises simply from the incommensuration of divine and created natures.
Could you unpack that term for the listener? Incommensuration?
Yeah, it basically means there is a massive, unbridgeable metaphysical gap between an infinite, perfectly holy God and finite, limited, messy creatures like us. We are categorically incompatible.
The scales don't align at all.
Right, and she uses a really intense, visceral metaphor to explain this. She suggests that humanity has no more rightful natural place in God's household than worms and maggots have in ours.
It's a jarring image for sure.
It really is. It feels incredibly harsh. But her point is that because of this infinite qualitative gap, we are fundamentally incapable of fitting an infinite God into our finite categories. We are inherently unclean simply by virtue of our radical limitation and finitude.
It's a philosophical view that suggests absolutely nothing we could naturally be and no action we could naturally perform would ever make us suitable or comfortable in divine company.
We're just too small.
Exactly. But while McCord Adams focuses on metaphysical limitation, the dominant historical way Christianity has understood this state of being is through the heavily debated doctrine of original sin.
Primarily formulated by Augustine.
Yes, Augustine's shadow over this topic is massive. He argued that because of that primal sin, the fall of Adam and Eve, humanity didn't just pick up a bad habit. We incurred a shattered nature.
He called it a chain of death.
He did. We are bound by a chain of death. Our internal desires are congenitally turned away from God from the very moment of conception.
And this is the precise moment where Christian theology splinters into wildly different, fascinating paradigms. Because the term original sin is used universally, but not every Christian denomination agrees on what it actually means, how it infects us, or what the legal ramifications are.
Looking at these denominational differences is absolutely crucial because it shows how your underlying theology dictates how you view the entire human condition.
So let's run through them. If we look at the Eastern Orthodox Church, they approach this from a completely different angle than Western Christianity.
Very different. The Eastern Orthodox tradition explicitly rejects the concept of inherited legal guilt. They do not believe that a child is born legally culpable or damned for the historical choice that Adam made.
So there's no courtroom setting for them?
No. They view the fall not as a crime that demands a courtroom penalty, but as a catastrophic infection. Sin is a terminal spiritual sickness. It is a self-perpetuating generational illness that severely distorts the image of God within the human soul.
So for the Orthodox believer, sin disorients our understanding of the world. It distracts us from what they call theosis, which is the ultimate goal of human existence, this natural potential to become deified, to partake in the divine nature through communion with God.
The metaphor shifts completely. If you view sin as a legal violation, you need a judge and a courtroom. But the Orthodox view sin as a disease, meaning humanity is a patient, and the Church acts as a hospital offering the medicine of immortality.
I love that hospital imagery. But then you contrast that holistic medical view with the traditional Methodist or Wesleyan Arminian theology.
Right, which is steeped in the Western tradition.
Yeah, so they do believe in a form of original sin, that humans are born with a profound corruption of nature. But John Wesley was incredibly specific about how he defined an actual sin.
Wesley was very pragmatic. He strictly defined sin properly, so-called as a voluntary transgression of a known law.
A known law, that implies a high level of cognitive awareness.
It does, and that's key. For Wesley, if an action was not a voluntary conscious choice to break a rule you fully understood, it was not properly a sin.
But people make mistakes all the time without knowing.
He acknowledged that. He knew humans make countless errors. We have prejudices, we make mistakes out of ignorance, our broken nature causes us to stumble. But he categorized these involuntary shortcomings as infirmities, rather than sins that incur eternal damnation.
And the most unique aspect of the Wesleyan holiness movement is their profound optimism about the cure. They heavily emphasize the power of God's grace, specifically what they call prevenient grace.
Prevenient grace is a vital concept here. It literally means the grace that comes before.
Before we do anything.
Right. Wesleyans believe that human nature is totally corrupted, but God universally extends this prevenient grace to all people, slightly lifting the veil, restoring just enough of our free will so that we can freely choose to accept or reject God.
And because of that grace and the subsequent process of sanctification, they believe it is genuinely possible for a believer to be entirely cleansed of the corruption of original sin. Like a person can live free from all voluntary sin in this present life.
They call it Christian perfection.
Christian perfection, the idea that the disease can be utterly eradicated before death, is a striking contrast to the Catholic view, isn't it?
Oh, very much so. The Roman Catholic tradition maintains a highly structured, categorical approach to post-baptismal sin, famously distinguishing between venial and mortal sins.
I think mortal sin is a term most people have heard in pop culture, but the mechanics behind it are actually incredibly specific.
The Catholic Catechism teaches that mortal sin is a catastrophic event in the life of the soul. It destroys the virtue of charity within the heart. It essentially severs the vital principle of spiritual life. But for an act to qualify as a mortal sin, it must meet three absolute conditions simultaneously.
It can't just be a simple mistake.
No, not at all. First, it must involve grave matter. It must be a severely serious offense against the moral law, like murder or adultery. Second, it requires full knowledge.
So you have to know it's a grave matter.
Yes. The person must intellectually know, without a doubt, that the act is deeply sinful and opposes God's law. And third, it requires deliberate consent. It must be a completely free, uncoerced choice of the will.
And if all three are there?
If all three are present and the person remains unreconciled, it separates them from God eternally.
But if any of those three are missing, say, the matter is minor, or you didn't fully understand it was wrong, or you acted out of sheer unthinking panic, it falls into the category of venial sin.
Right. Venial sins are lesser offenses. They injure the relationship with God. They impede the soul's progress in virtue. And they warrant temporal punishment, but they do not completely destroy the indwelling of charity. They don't break the covenant.
It's a highly systematized way of weighing the internal will against the external action. But then we look at groups like the Latter-day Saints, and the paradigm shifts radically again. They explicitly and fundamentally reject the entire premise of inheriting Adam's guilt.
Their articles of faith state plainly that individuals will be punished solely for their own personal sins and not for Adam's transgression.
So no inherited guilt whatsoever.
Correct. They believe the fall was actually a necessary step in human progression. Because of this focus on individual accountability, they believe that children under the age of 8 are entirely incapable of committing sin. They cannot be held accountable until they reach the age of reason.
While Jehovah's Witnesses approach the state of the soul from a different metaphysical angle altogether, they view sin as a literal inherited disease passed down from generation to generation through Adam. But the crucial distinction is their view of the soul itself.
They do not believe humans possess an immortal soul that separates from the body at death and goes to heaven or hell.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they believe humans are living souls. Therefore, the ultimate resulting punishment for the inherited disease of sin is simply literal death, the cessation of existence.
So we have this massive spectrum: the Orthodox hospital, the Methodist perfection, the Catholic categorization, the Latter-day Saint individual accountability. But for the massive branches of Western Christianity that do hold tightly to Augustine's original view, the view of original guilt, we have to stop and confront a really tough, visceral question.
It's the core problem of justice.
Yeah. If I was not physically in the Garden of Eden, if I didn't reach out and eat the fruit, if I wasn't even born yet, how is it just or fair that I am born completely guilty and legally condemned for it?
That is the crux of the issue. How can guilt be transferred across millennia? Theologians have developed two primary philosophical defenses to explain the mechanics of this: federalism and realism.
Federalism, when I hear that, I immediately think of a government system or a legal structure.
And you should, because it is fundamentally a legal framework. Federalism, which is also known as representationalism, argues that God appointed Adam as the legal representative, the federal head of the entire human race.
He was standing in for us.
Exactly. He was acting on our behalf in a probationary test. When he failed the test, his legal guilt was instantly imputed or credited to every single person he represented.
So to put this in modern terms, it is like a CEO of a massive corporation making a disastrous, fraudulent legal decision. Now, the thousands of employees working in the mailroom or on the factory floor didn't sign the fraudulent documents.
It had nothing to do with it.
Right. They didn't make the choice. But because the CEO was the legally appointed representative of the company, the entire company goes bankrupt, and every single employee loses their pension. The legal reality cascades down and crushes everyone.
That analogy captures the mechanics perfectly. It is an objective legal reality regardless of individual participation. Realism, however, takes a much more organic, almost biological approach.
Okay, how does realism work?
Realists, following Augustine's intuition, argue that all of humanity was literally somehow present in Adam. We don't just share a legal representative, we spring from his exact stock, so we genuinely share in the actual fault.
But how does that work philosophically? We weren't biologically present as conscious beings.
Augustine was notoriously vague on the exact metaphysical mechanics of that. But later thinkers, specifically the American theologian Jonathan Edwards, developed it into a staggering philosophical concept.
What did Edwards argue?
Edwards argued for what he called a divine constitution. He posited that the continuous identity of anything over time depends completely at every given moment on God's arbitrary constitution.
Meaning God holds reality together from frame to frame, like a movie projector.
Yes. And Edwards argued that God simply declares, as a matter of absolute metaphysical truth, that the entire human race is one continuous, unified entity with Adam. We are the same tree.
So if federalism is the CEO bankrupting the company, realism is more like inheriting a devastating genetic disorder from a parent, but elevated to a metaphysical level where God views the entire human family tree as a single, indivisible organism.
The branches cannot claim innocence when the root is poisoned.
I have to ask, though, how does this concept of federalism or collective guilt sit with a modern listener? You and I live in a Western society that practically worships extreme individualism.
We absolutely do.
We judge people solely on their own merits, their own resumes, and their own actions. Is the very premise of original guilt inherently offensive to the post-Enlightenment mind?
It absolutely rubs against the grain of everything modern society holds dear. The idea that you are born into a state of total legal condemnation before you've taken a single conscious breath feels profoundly unjust.
Because we couldn't do anything about it.
Right, it violates what philosophers call the principle of possible prevention. The intuitive idea that you can only be held morally responsible for an event if you had the power to prevent it. And obviously, sitting here thousands of years later, none of us could prevent Adam's fall.
It leaves humanity with a heavy, overwhelmingly bleak diagnosis. Whether you view it as a terminal orthodox sickness, a terrifying ontological uncleanness like McCord-Adams suggests, or a crushing legal bankruptcy through federalism, humanity is trapped.
We are unable to cure ourselves.
Which forces us to pivot to the core of the Christian narrative. How does theology propose a cure to an incurable disease? This brings us to the absolute centerpiece of the faith and one particular theologian's frantic, obsessive quest for peace.
We're talking, of course, about the German reformer Martin Luther.
To understand the cure, you have to understand Luther's absolute terror of the disease. For anyone who has studied his life, you know the man was mentally and spiritually tormented.
He was agonizing over his soul.
As a monk, he was crushed under the weight of his own perceived sinfulness. He would spend up to 6 hours a day in confession, terrified that he had missed a subjective sin or forgotten a sin of omission. He realized that if the standard was perfection, He was utterly doomed.
until he experienced a massive theological breakthrough regarding the doctrine of justification by faith.
Right. And I mean, for Luther, justification isn't just, some theological doctrine sitting in a textbook.
Not at all.
Mm.
It is the doctrine upon which the entire church stands or falls. He famously stated that if the doctrine of justification is lost, simply everything is lost. All of Christian truth collapses without it.
He practically yells it in his writings. He says, "In my heart, one article alone rules supreme, that of faith in Christ." But what exactly is the mechanism here? What is he contrasting this faith with?
He is contrasting it with the law. This is the most vital theological distinction in Lutheranism, the absolute dichotomy between law and gospel.
Okay, let's break those down.
The law, for Luther, represents the divine standard. Its primary function is to accuse. It acts as a mirror that exposes our terminal sickness, highlights our inability to save ourselves, and terrifies the conscience. It shows us the target we have missed.
It's the X-ray showing the broken bone, but offering no cast.
Exactly. The gospel, on the other hand, is the remedy. It is the message of Christ's atonement, the divine mechanism designed to bridge that infinite impossible gap between human sin and divine perfection.
So it brings comfort.
Yes, the law terrifies, but the gospel comforts and brings profound peace.
So justification by faith means that a person is legally declared righteous by God, not because they suddenly stopped sinning or became perfectly moral in their daily actions, but because Christ's perfect righteousness is imputed or credited to their account entirely through faith.
Yes. Luther uses justification as a grand, integrating theological principle. It becomes the lens through which he interprets all of reality and reads every page of the Bible. It provides absolute certainty to the terrified conscience.
It's an external focus then.
Completely. When the law accuses you, when your disposition toward wrath or pride rears its head, you don't look inward at your own actions for comfort because your actions are flawed. You look entirely outward to the external, finished reality of Christ.
To take this to its absolute philosophical limit, contemporary philosophers look at this concept of the atonement, this ultimate remedy that brings such peace to Luther, and they extrapolate it out to answer the biggest question in philosophy.
Yeah.
The problem of evil itself.
Yes, the big one.
If God is good, why is there sin and suffering at all? I'm talking about Alvin Plantinga and the O Felix Culpa theodicy.
O Felix Culpa translates from Latin to O happy fault. It's a poetic concept that has existed in church liturgy for centuries, but Plantinga has refined it into a formal, rigorous philosophical defense. Specifically, he constructs what is called a supralapsarian theodicy.
Supralapsarian. That is a heavy academic word. Let's break that down for the listener. What does that actually mean regarding the timeline of the universe?
Well, it refers to the logical order of God's internal decrees before creation. Supra means above or before, and lapsus refers to the fall.
Okay, before the fall.
Right. A supralapsarian model argues that, logically, God decreed his ultimate desire to save humanity through the spectacular events of the Incarnation and Atonement before he even decreed to permit the fall into sin.
Wait, let me make sure I'm hearing this right. God desired the cure of the atonement before the disease of sin even existed. Why would he want to deploy a rescue mission if nobody was drowning?
Well, it all comes down to what Plantinga calls the strong value assumption. Plantinga approaches this by weighing the value of different potential universes. He argues that every possible world God could create is good. A pristine, perfect world where Adam and Eve never sin is a very good world. But, Plantinga argues, a world that contains the staggering, towering, infinite goods of God, actually becoming human, the Incarnation, and God suffering out of love to redeem his creatures, the Atonement.
That world is better.
Yes, that world is infinitely better and more intrinsically valuable than a sterile, perfect world that never required a savior.
So God permitted, or even desired, the absolute nightmare of human sin solely because it set the necessary stage for the most spectacular, beautiful demonstration of divine love possible. The fall was a happy fault because it brought us a much greater reality.
Sin, in this deeply controversial view, becomes the necessary functional means to achieve the ultimate cosmic good. The darkness is printed so the light can shine brighter.
I have to throw a massive wrench into this. Pulling from philosophers like Marilyn McCord Adams and Kevin Diller in our sources, this supralapsarian view feels deeply problematic.
It definitely raises red flags.
Because if God permits horrific evils, I mean, think of the worst things in human history. Wars, disease, unspeakable cruelty, just to set the stage to demonstrate the glory of his own atonement. Isn't God using human creatures as mere instruments?
The means to an end.
Right. As expendable props in his own cosmic theater, it sounds like an arsonist who sets a building on fire just so he can be the glorious hero who runs in and saves everyone.
You are hitting on the exact moral revulsion that critics like William Hasker and Kevin Diller level against Plantinga. They argue it violates the foundational moral principle that you should not do evil so that good may come.
You can't justify the means with the ends.
Exactly. It instrumentalizes human suffering. It treats the agony of billions as a necessary byproduct for the maximization of God's glory.
And McCord Adams points out a glaring logical flaw in the setup, too. Is sin actually necessary for God to show his love? Couldn't God have become incarnate without the fall?
Yes, and many great medieval theologians recognize this too. The incarnation and the atonement are actually logically independent events.
They don't have to be linked.
Right. God could have easily chosen to become human, to join his creation in profound intimacy, even if Adam and Eve had never touched the fruit. The incarnation would still be a cosmic excellence. So the idea that sin and suffering were strictly necessary for intimacy with God completely falls apart.
Furthermore, McCord Adams talks about what she calls horrors. These are evils so profound, so devastating, that they threaten to destroy any positive meaning in a person's life whatsoever.
And her argument there is really powerful.
She argues you absolutely cannot justify a horror by telling the victim that their suffering contributed to a grand, beautiful, cosmic picture of atonement.
Because the math doesn't work for the victim. McCord Adams argues that for a theodicy to be morally legitimate, the evil must be defeated within the actual life of the person who suffered it.
It has to make sense for them personally.
Yes, you cannot justify my eternal ruin or my profound earthly trauma by pointing to a spreadsheet and saying it made the universe as a whole look 10% more glorious.
It's a breathtaking philosophical debate. But even if we step back and accept justification and the atonement as the ultimate sweeping remedy for the legal and spiritual weight of sin, we still have to wake up tomorrow.
The day-to-day continues.
The day-to-day reality is that the residual damage of the disease is still here. We may be legally saved, but we're still practically sick. How does this lingering disease warp the very way we think, and how does it infect the institutions we build together?
This brings us to a massive necessary expansion in our understanding of sin's reach. We have to examine what the theologians call the noetic effects of sin.
Noetic effects.
Noetic, referring directly to the mind, the intellect, and our capacity for rationality.
Because sin doesn't just make us do bad things, it actually makes us stupid. It breaks our ability to perceive reality.
Put bluntly, yes. In the Reformed tradition, Alvin Plantinga developed a concept he calls the extended AC model, named as a tribute to Aquinas and Calvin.
How does that model work?
Plantinga argues that human beings are created with a cognitive faculty called the sensus divinitatis. It is a natural mechanism designed to intuitively know God and perceive his glory in the world, much in the same way we have natural mechanisms for perceiving light, sound, or the existence of other minds.
But the primal glitch fried the hardware.
Exactly. Plantinga argues that original sin severely damaged this sensus divinitatis. It was ruined by the introduction of pride and self-love.
So what's the result of that damage?
As a result of this damaged hardware, we suffer from a sort of cognitive blindness. It causes a failure to accurately know moral facts and a failure to perceive true value. We love the wrong things, we hate the right things, and we cannot see God clearly.
And the philosopher Merold Westphal takes this even further with a brilliant concept he calls the law of inverse rationality. He argues that the more existential import a subject has meaning, the more it actually matters to our lives, our identity, and our souls, the more our human thought is distorted by sinful desire and pride.
It's a remarkably astute observation of human psychology, really. We can be perfectly rational, cold, and objective when solving a complex calculus equation because the math doesn't threaten our ego.
Right. Calculus doesn't care if I'm a good person.
Exactly. It doesn't demand we change our lives. But the moment we are tasked with assessing our own moral failures or acknowledging a divine authority that might demand our submission, our intellect immediately panics and deploys massive walls of self-deception.
We suddenly become masters of rationalization. The philosopher Ed Hudson touches on this too. He argues that sin actively encourages us to live in a state of rampant, continuous self-deception.
We lie to ourselves.
Constantly. This deception masks our ability to even know what true human well-being is anymore. We build idols, we chase wealth, we chase status, genuinely believing these things will bring us peace, completely blinded to the fact that we are systematically starving our own souls.
And if we pull back and connect this cognitive failure to the bigger picture, it explains the final, most pervasive form of sin. If every individual's intellect is compromised by self-deception and a damaged sensus divinitatis, then what happens when we gather together? The societies, the economies, the institutions we build are going to be fundamentally warped.
This introduces the concept of structural sin.
Structural sin.
Yes. This is where the concept of sin steps completely out of the individual heart and gets baked into the concrete of the city.
Drawing on the wisdom of Maximus the Confessor, a profound 6th century theologian, we can see that sin is fundamentally a breakdown of community.
A fragmentation.
It is a slide into extreme, isolated individualization, where we begin to see other human beings as competitors, threats, or objects to be used, rather than fellow bearers of the divine image.
And the sources detail some incredible philosophical arguments about how this historic breakdown manifests in our modern world. Theologians argue that things like systemic racism, implicit bias, and patriarchy are not just political buzzwords, they are literal theological manifestations of structural sin.
Katie Walker Grimes, for instance, argues that anti-blackness functions as a corporate vice.
A corporate vice.
Yes. It's a sinful habit that isn't just held by individuals, but is deeply embedded in the social body, in economic policies, and in segregated spaces.
Similarly, thinkers like Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza and Rachel Sophia Bard argue that patriarchy acts as a massive structural evil. It is an institutionalized ideology. And the insidious nature of structural sin is that it creates a false consciousness.
It obscures itself.
Right. It is so pervasive that it often permits oppressed people to internalize the destructive values of their oppressors. Sin here operates as a transpersonal, invisible power that dominates society.
To make this tangible, structural sin is like living in a massive, sprawling apartment building where the concrete foundation was accidentally poured at a 15-degree angle.
Oh, that's a great visual.
You might be standing in your living room acting perfectly moral. You believe you're standing perfectly straight. You are individually just. You are kind to your neighbors in the hallway. You pay your taxes on time.
But the building is leaning.
But because the entire structure you inhabit is leaning, you are leaning with it. You are participating in and benefiting from the corrupt structure without ever making a conscious individual choice to do so.
And that is why it is so difficult to combat. It masks itself as the natural order of the universe. Theologian Stephen Ray calls structural sin mundane because it hides in plain sight.
It just looks normal.
Exactly. It normalizes suffering and systemic inequality so effectively that we don't even recognize it as a manifestation of sin. We just think, well, that's just the way the world works.
But looking at this through the lens of feminist theology raises a massive, fascinating tension from the text. Traditional theology, going all the way back through the centuries to Augustine, identifies the root of all sin as pride.
The arrogance of the self.
Yes, it is the arrogant desire to elevate oneself above God and above others. Therefore, the traditional cure preached by the church for 2 millennia has been humility, self-sacrifice, and obedience.
The required shattering of the ego.
Exactly.
But wait, let's apply that to the leaning building analogy. If a systemic, structural sin like patriarchy or racism has already spent generations crushing a marginalized person's self-worth, if society has already violently negated their identity, doesn't preaching humility and self-negation to them actually aggravate their oppression?
You have articulated Rachel Sophia Bard's exact critique of traditional hamartiology. She argues that female pathology, for instance, is typically not rooted in the sinful, prideful elevation of the self, but in the socially enforced, tragic negation of the self.
They've already been humbled.
Exactly. If a woman is suffering under the crushing weight of gender-based violence or systemic suppression, telling her that she needs to practice more humility and regard others as better than herself is not just unhelpful, it is spiritually abusive.
Wow.
It reinforces the very structural sin that is destroying her.
It essentially weaponizes the theological cure to worsen the disease. It tells the person at the bottom of the leaning building to just lay flat so others can walk on them.
Precisely. Bard suggests we need a massive shift in rhetoric, moving away from constantly blaming individual moral failings and pride, and focusing intensely on dismantling the systemic oppression.
It requires us to recognize the full scope of the diagnosis. Because sin is multi-layer, acting simultaneously as a deliberate individual choice, an inherited tragic condition of the soul, and a pervasive structural reality, the remedy must also be multi-layered.
We cannot treat a structural disease with merely individualistic medicine.
Which forces us to look back at the staggering journey we've just taken over the last hour. We started with the seemingly simple, manageable definition of breaking a rule, analyzing the mechanics of an archer missing a mark through omission or commission.
And from there, we waded into the profound, unanswerable mystery of the primal sin, debating Anselm's uncaused leap of the will against Plantinga's miscalculating intellect.
We sank into the heavy, almost crushing metaphysical reality of original guilt. Looking at McCord Adams's maggots, the Orthodox hospital, and the heated debates over whether we inherit Adam's legal penalty like a bankrupt company or a genetic predisposition to fail.
We looked to Martin Luther's desperate, frantic grasp for the peace of justification, and Wade Plantinga's daring assertion that the nightmare of the fall was a happy fault, designed to showcase the ultimate rescue mission.
And finally, we realize that this disease blinds our intellect through the law of inverse rationality and weaves itself into the very concrete foundations of our institutions and societies. For you listening right now, I know this is a staggering amount of weight.
That's a lot to process.
Hearing a word that you hear tossed around every day casually on television, suddenly expanded into this terminal, cosmic, and societal diagnosis, it is heavy. But it also reveals the sheer intellectual, philosophical, and theological depth that thousands of years of human thought have poured into understanding what is fundamentally wrong with the world and how we might begin to fix it.
And, grappling with that magnitude leads us to a final vital question for you to consider. If structural sin deeply shapes all of our institutions, and the noetic effects of sin severely cloud our intellectual judgment and our rationality, how can we be absolutely sure that the very theological and philosophical frameworks we have just spent this entire hour using to try and understand the concept of sin haven't themselves been distorted by it?
Wow. Are we using a cracked lens to examine the crack itself? Something to mull over? Until next time.